I am so excited to talk today with Kenneth Danford, one of the true pioneers in alternative education. In 1996, Ken launched North Star, a self directed learning center for teen homeschoolers in Western Massachusetts, which was one of the first such spaces to exist. Prior to launching North Star, Ken was a middle school social studies teacher in public schools and wanted to create a new, non coercive learning option for young people. Fast forward to 2013, Ken and his colleague Joel Hammond decided to create Liberated Learners, a global network of self directed learning centers modeled after North Star that continues to help aspiring education entrepreneurs create self directed learning centers in their own communities. In 2019, Ken published the book Learning is Natural, School is Optional: The North Star Approach to Offering Teens a Head Start on Life, which I highly recommend. Ken
Thank you.
Danford, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here always.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here. You're just such an inspiration. You've really been, as I said, a pioneer in alternative education and in promoting the idea of self-directed learning and non-coercion in education. And I'd love to just sort of get your story about what was happening in your life as a middle school teacher back in the early 1990s, and that ultimately led you to say, "Hey, I think I can do things better."
Sure. I liked my public school experience and in Shaker Heights, Ohio, became a public school teacher first in Prince George's County, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., and then up here in Amherst, Massachusetts, college town with good public schools. And I was really on my way to being a school reformer. I was enrolled in a doctorate program at UMass to become an administrator. I really thought I was on the way to being Secretary of Education. And I loved, doing eighth grade U.S. history from a, multicultural lens and all the good stuff that I care about. But it turned out that I felt I was harming many kids and that the rigidness of the school was hurtful and that I wasn't really in a position to change that. I was discouraged that a lot of the kids were just trying to get the grade they wanted and were cheering the last day of school. These very same kids who cried when camp is over or when they're in a theater program and they strike the set. Why don't they cry when my class is over? I want to be one of those people. And how am I going to reform schools so that that happens? And then I decided that's not really going to happen because what it would take is less rigidity, less coerciveness, less grades, allowing students to say, I don't want to come here on Thursdays because I have a nature program to go to and I'm only going to come 4 days a week. I think I got my writing skills solid, so I don't want to do English this year. Thank you very much. Or I only want English, or I only want art. School isn't going to reform in the direction of empowering children and students and teens to live well. And school's kind of stuck. I like to say my grandmothers, bless them, they used to be alive when I was saying this before, so now they'd have to rise from the dead, but they could walk into public school and know how to behave without very much confusion. It's a little discouraging when I look forward to like how can this change. Um, and so my friend Joshua Hornick gave me a copy of Grace Llewellyn's Teenage Liberation Handbook. I knew nothing about homeschooling, zero, and I didn't want to know anything about homeschooling in 1995. Thank you very much. And then I found out from this book primarily, and then a full project afterwards, as you know, I like to pursue my own interests, of that there was a subset of homeschooling with the unschooling, the self-directed learning thing, where these kids were just cheating. They're getting away with it. They're not schooling at home. They're not being taught by their parents. They're just doing the thing they love: writing, counting, science, sports, music, horses, and and it works, and they get to go to Harvard or wherever college they want to, or they're starting their own businesses, and it's a perfectly healthy way to grow up without school. And I was dumbfounded. Who didn't tell me that you could do this? And what do I think of this? And I didn't think very long. I thought it was pretty cool. And then I thought, I can't barge in on the handful of like 5 kids in Western Mass who are doing this in 1995 or 96. They don't need me. They don't want me. They're fine without me. They have no money. It's not a business. What I need to do is help all these school kids who I'm tormenting. I want to help them use this unschooling, homeschooling lifestyle. So what would it take to tell a bunch of 8th graders, and by that means, 7th graders and high schoolers in the next town over as well, what does it take to tell teens and parents in our community, we're going to help you use this alternative approach to learning, empowering? Well, it seemed to Josh and me the first thing you need to do is rent a center. It'd be an in-person program. This is 95, 96, remind you. Um, and I still think that. Obviously, there's more online options, but I still think it takes an in-person gathering center where you can have some class, YMCA type, senior center type, current events and history and book groups and science and trips and hikes and dance and theater and rock bands and the whole thing. A social place where kids can be, one-on-one tutoring. And as we've learned at North Star, in addition to one-on-one tutoring, everybody has an advisor they meet with once a week to really assess for themselves how things are going. Are they really doing the things they intend to be doing? Are they satisfied with their use of North Star? What about out in the world? Have they signed up for the community college class? Did they apply for the job? Did they do the driver's license process? How are their parents handling it? What about the other kids here? How are they managing? So the advisory turns out to be pretty darn important. And so we just started, for me, it allowed me to work with kids without having to give them grades, without having credits to give or withhold, without having diplomas to confer or deny. They don't need them from me anyway. And why do I want to give something they don't need? Turns out all the homeschooling, unschooling people can go to college independently. Many of our kids choose to get a GED or high set in Massachusetts, though it's not 100% necessary, but that's the common approach in our neck of the woods compared to using a full-fledged homeschooling plan curriculum, or some parents make their own diplomas. As all the options, but turns out I get to work with kids without having power over them other than to ask them to be nice when they're at North Star. 65 kids, lots of staff, and they can use us for as many years as they wish. There's no reason to stay till age 18, though we do always have some 18, 19-year-olds at North Star because they're not quite done with us yet. But we also have 16, 17-year-olds who are through with us. So it's a very open, fluid place. Kids come in and going all day. They never have to be here. When they're here, they can mostly do what they want. We do have a once a week community meeting. They do have to check in with their advisor once a week. But otherwise, it's very respectful, and it's very, as I said before, very empowering to teens and parents. Many of these kids were really struggling. More than half were managing. They're doing okay in school before us. They're going every day and they're passing and sometimes even on honor roll. But there's a good set of North Star kids who were dealing with mental health woes, stress, anxiety, all the things that we know about in this culture, depression, bullying, and school not being very appealing. And to be able to tell them they don't have to fix it, and in fact, they don't even have to go back right now. We could help them write a homeschooling plan tonight so they don't ever go to school again tomorrow. Is shockingly powerful, right? So it's a joy, and thousand, couple, whatever, how many kids later, here we are, year 27, still doing it.
Ah, just amazing. You're still doing it. And of course, now we also see so many other education entrepreneurs creating learning centers and micro schools. I have many of them on this podcast, and they talk about their journey to launching some new learning model. But you were doing it before anyone else, really. I mean, you were one of the first. What was that like to be sort of an education entrepreneur at a time where this was all new, others weren't doing it, and you were really taking a leap? What was that like?
It's very exciting. It was the revolution. We were ridiculous. We had no role models. There was a Sudbury school, and my colleague Joshua had applied to create a charter school in Massachusetts as a Sudbury type public charter school, which of course the Charter Commission rejected because that's not the sort of charter school they want to have. Um, and that didn't really intrigue me personally because it would still be a public school with all the requirements and attendance issues and so on. And I knew vaguely little about homeschooling co-ops and some parent organized things that were sometimes excellent and sometimes, but they were fleeting. As long as the strong parents' kids were in it, they kept it going.
Mm.
Still true. And so we didn't have anybody to look at. We looked at each other and we're like, well, these kids that we're tormenting in Amherst junior high, how can we help them do the Grace the Well and unschooling thing? Well, we just made it up, right? And so I get that was kind of fun, and it's still remarkably fun. It's fine. I always said back then, someday we'll be like the natural foods grocery stores of the 1970s. We'll be the people in the basement. It was a basement, and it was kind of cruddy at first. Now we're in a nice building, which I happen to own. It would come a long way in 27 years, but in terms of property. But it was a a basement garage type operation for 6 years called Pathfinder, and it really was the revolution. And I always have this sense that the culture will catch up, and other people will come in with different visions, more resources, more marketing, more all sorts of, more expertise, whatever. More, it doesn't have to only be this, right? Um, and so I feel like maybe we're finally getting there post pandemic. I haven't felt that much before now, but it seems like the culture is shifting in the last couple of years. Um, and also, it's the kind of thing now where everybody knows somebody who homeschooled and didn't die. So the whole homeschooling fear is decreased. The whole parents can say they're going to try homeschooling without being quite so embarrassed as back in the 95.
Yeah, and homeschooling was growing in population and diversifying in terms of who was doing it pre 2020. But as you say, that's really skyrocketed over the past few years. And in 2013, you and Joel Hammond launched Liberated Learners to really recognize that there was this growing interest in schooling alternatives, that homeschooling was growing and becoming much more of a mainstream option. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what was the evolution towards creating Liberated Learners.
Sure, Joel Hammond came to our first so-called replication workshop for the model in 2007, and but in 2010 he started Princeton Learning Cooperative, and then shortly, or in the couple years after, started two more, Raritan and Bucks Learning Cooperative in the New Jersey, Pennsylvania area. Um, and there were a number of inquiries about the model and how we work with kids and how it's similar or different to Sudbury or democratic schools or homeschooling co-ops and whatnot. And Joel and I decided that it would be healthy to separate the consulting and the modeling and the workshops, separate that from North Star's day-to-day business. So we created a separate 501c3 called Liberated Learners to do that. And we still have that going. We still offer twice a month free webinars. We offer limited short-term consulting. We have a starters package for people who want to start a program in our domain. We talk about the similarities and differences of our models to the other, like the Agiles and the democratic free schools and whatnot. Now there's just a whole, plethora of micro schools and pods and who knows what everybody uses for vocabulary. And so in 2013, we just separated the consulting out. There's now about 12 to 15 centers in us, around the United States, but also Canada, also Philippines, also Australia, maybe another one coming on. We've spoken to people. These webinars we do are all over the world. It's really great fun to talk to people all over the world about alternatives to conventional schooling. So, and the other thing that and brings us up to the present, and I know that we've discussed this a little bit. We've also helped maybe 25 centers start that have closed, in the past 10 years. It's really hard to sustain these models with no public money. And so trying to build a model that is affordable, but at the same time pays teachers and has a decent space is a very tricky circle to fill. Private schools often do that by having higher tuitions, especially that I'm familiar with in Massachusetts. It seems across the country there may be less expensive private schools, but not here. Massachusetts, they're expensive. And that's how they do it. Others have a lot of fundraising or angel donors or founding donors, or they have staff working for low wages, which was North Star's operational choice for a while. It's not really sustainable. And at some point, 6, 7, 8 years, even though I'm proud that people started and kept things going as long as they did, it's hard to sustain them, right? And so there's a whole lot of people that we've helped coach up, do good work, but then, stop. And so there's 15 still going, but I bet there's been 45, something like that, centers overall. So it's and I don't think it's inherent to our model. I think that's inherently true for the Agiles, for the democratic free schools, every small boutique, and I'm sure it's got to be true for the micro schools. If someone wants to launch a little program in their neighborhood for 6 other kids, but they want to make a real living at it, and they're paying any rental space, not using their house for it, and there's 2 adults in it, you're going to be at a budget before long that's requiring $8,000 to $10,000 a kid. I
Right.
think that's my wonderful assessment. So part of Liberated Learners is very thrilling that there's so many people interested, and I get to talk to and meet to people all over the world. And we have a map. We have a liberatedlearners.net website with a map with my little buttons all over. It's really delightful. It's a highlight of my month to do the free webinars and then the long-term relationships with the people who have opened, and even those who have closed, I'm still in touch with and friendly with. It's been a real joy of my life to share this approach, these ideas, and have this network of colleagues instead of doing it alone at North Star is really great fun. It's just at this very moment or this year, I'm, I'm working on it.
Yeah, and so over the past 3 years, obviously not only has there been more interest in homeschooling and micro schools and more, often public school teachers like you leaving the system to create their own models, but there's also been growth in school choice policies, education choice policies, across the country, including some really expansive policies like in Arizona, the first to create the first universal education savings account program that enables funding to follow students and to be used for a whole variety of educational expenses, including private school tuition, micro school tuition, homeschooling expenses, educational therapies, tutoring, so on. And I know this has been something that's more recently piqued your interest, I imagine, because of your experience in seeing so many promising centers close because of the inability to sustain themselves financially, because you do try to keep your costs really low for families. So I wonder what that process has been like for you to think about the possibilities of education choice and how it could benefit education entrepreneurs who want to create North Star type programs, as well as homeschoolers more generally.
Yeah, this is really occupying all of my energy these days. And before I dive into that, let me just say that North Star has its website, northstarteens.org. I have my book, I have a TED Talk, kennethdanford.com. If you want to know more about how North Star works internally, I'd be delighted to talk to you or have you come to a Liberated Learners webinar sometime. Anyway, because we're going to move on to outside of the internal machinations of how North Star works.
Well, we
Um,
may go back to North Star in a bit, but let's talk about
it's fine.
policy and then
Yeah,
we can go back.
I'm pretty excited about this. I could go the
Okay.
next hour with this. So,
Okay,
um,
great.
so I'm just saying, if you want to know more, I'd be glad to talk to you some other time. Um, so last year, three close friends shut their centers, and looking at it, I'm just these. I wrote in a blog piece that I have on my kennethdanford.com website in January. I need a new project this year. I want to understand public finance of homeschooling and alternative education because I think that I don't think there's enough philanthropy around, and I don't think there's enough wealthy people to work for low salaries around to create centers in every community the way that I wish there were. We really want to open up uh, educational opportunities for all families. I think it's going to require some public money. I'm pretty sure I know that now. 10 years of liberated learners, and I'm pretty sure that I'm saying what I think I know. And so it's taken me a while to get here. And so I
Why
launched.
is that, Ken? What
Well,
yeah.
I'm dubious of strings attached with public money.
Mhm.
There's a whole lot of self control, and I just want it to work. I think homeschooling can be an inexpensive approach, and these centers should be simpler to finance and run, and people should just be able to pay. They should just work. I want them to work. These little micro schools and people's little inspirations. They should it. But you know what? When you want to make a decent wage and you want to have a building that's not a dump, um, and not your house, and you're gonna have two or three people running it, or two or three equivalent full-time staff equivalent that are making functional wages, living wages, or better, even remotely approaching, not even equal to, but approaching, public school union wages. Get out of here, right? Because that's with benefits and pensions, and there's no, it's not. It's taken me just a lot of accepting that I can't just fundraise or charge my way or manipulate the budget to that level. And I'm just seeing fewer, even people I think could join me in that enterprise are just, I'm just feeling like I have to acknowledge this is way harder to do than I want it to be. Is that a good
Well,
enough
and
answer,
it's
Terry?
and it's partly because you don't wanna charge $40,000, $50,000 that secular private schools in a state like Massachusetts are charging. Like, you want this to be accessible to families, and like you said, it's difficult to fundraise your way toward that.
And most families out here, Western Mass, I mean, we get 8 to 10,000 from a handful of our members, but most, frankly, it's the 3 to 6 range is where I think most people can
Mm.
afford per kid per year routinely. When we're really getting to the not the lowest income people, but modest income, and the middle 50, 60% of incomes out here. I don't think everybody can afford 10,000 a year out
Right.
here.
And
And
that 3 to 6 range really is the range that we're seeing, of education savings accounts, across the country.
Which,
In Arizona, it's just under 8,
right,
8 or 7,000. So, yeah, so it's in that sweet spot, that could make this more accessible.
yeah. I'm also, to be blunt, I come from liberal democratic roots. I'm a public school person. My whole family, my parents, everybody I know, my cousins, everybody I know went to public school. Right? I'm a public school dude. And to the extent that the ESAs and the homeschooling and the private schooling and the school choice movement has a aura of, hurting public schooling, it's hard. And even though I'm ready to explore beyond that, it took me a while to overcome some of that resistance.
Mhm.
Um, and concerns about who's getting the money and how it's being spent, and is it being spent on things, for anyway. It's hard for me with some of the politics around it, but I'm working on it. Um, because so when I started my exploration, I was just stunned that, again, like homeschooling in general in '95. This is another moment in January of 2023 where I was like, wait a second, there's a whole world going on here that I have not known about, because it has not it's not discussed in Massachusetts. It's not discussed in my circles. Nobody
Sure.
I know is talking about ESAs. It's not a thing in my world, right? I spent 1 week Googling and reading, and I'm like, oh my God, these people are getting 5,000, 7,000, $8,000. And it's not just in New Hampshire, it's income graduated.
Right.
But in Arizona, it's not. And Kansas and Florida and Iowa and everywhere now, like a whole slew of states have
Right.
these. And wait a second, the train's left without me. It's gone. Like I'm now got to hurry up and catch up. I just and so that's what I'm doing, because the positive end of this, for sure, is that if every family could come in here with $3,000 to $5,000 and then pay some tuition to match it on top of it, North Star would be set forever. And if I was consulting people who want to open centers, and they are in states where every single customer, student, family would approach them with a $3,000 to $5,000 head start on payment, it'd be way easier to build and sustain these programs, right? It's just like, clearly from my professional career, this is what we need, right? And not vouchers, because we're not private schools. We don't want to be schools. We don't want to compel full time attendance. We're not doing in lieu of compulsory schooling. We're trying to help people legally not go to school and have all their freedom. So
Right.
it has to be the ESA model, not just vouchers, right? You guys are way ahead of me. These ESA people figured it out, right? And then it even rolls over so that if you don't spend it,
Yes.
you get to carry.
In
That
some
means, like,
states.
there's
Yep.
no burden just to waste it on, like, might as well buy tutoring we don't want just because we can spend it. Like, no, you roll it over. I mean, the whole thing is brilliant from my professional perspective, right? And then we get to, is it really universal? Like, the wealthiest people I know are getting these too? Well, I guess so, right? And that's part of, yeah, you might chime in on that, but I guess that's part of building the enthusiasm, and just it's just it just is. Um
Well, in some states, like you mentioned, New Hampshire, it's still income graduated, so it is
and
still focused on low income families. Now we've seen this slew of states pass universal ESAs, so it
eh,
varies.
yeah, and I'm working on public policy. Like, I get my wheels are turning on that. It wouldn't come naturally to me. It also strikes me as quite bizarre that this whole transfer of tax money to low income families is sort of the most socialistic thing I've ever heard of, coming from largely conservatives who, haven't wanted to do tax benefit programs for low income. I don't know. The whole thing is very like, very. I'm new to it, right? I'm working on it, but it is a whole lot of money to people, and specifically directly to people, in a way that usually liberals are more for than conservatives. Would you think, or not? Am I making it up?
Well, I mean, the taxpayer money is already going to, public education, primarily
Right.
public schooling. And so I think school choice advocates would say we need to provide more choice for families so that that public education can be broader than just government run schooling. It could be public funded, not government run. And that's where it's really redistributing those funds to families for them to be able to make the choice that works for them and that's aligned with their personal preferences and educational values. And that could be a self-directed learning center like North Star. It could be a classical micro school that's more of a kind of a traditional educational model. It could be a Montessori micro school. It could be, a whole host of things. And that's where I think school choice advocates would say that it's that decentralization and diversification of education options that's so critical.
Right. So we live in a small town in Western Mass, and my son wanted to go to the public school, and he did 7 through 12, and he loved it. Played football. The whole thing was great for him. But really, because of charter schools, and I'll talk about charter schools in a minute too, because that's doubly blowing my mind now. I got to come back to charter schools in a moment. But his school is down to like 2 English teachers, 2 math teachers, no electives. I mean, the school still has to deal with the buses. It still has to deal with paraprofessionals for every special education student. Like, I just, as I'm coming on the bandwagon, I just want to have a little protection of like the core budget of the. I think it's good that every town has a. I wish the public school weren't so rigid and were more flexible. I wrote about it in my book about my ideal of it just being more like a community college and just open ended. But the place with the auditorium and the gym and the pool and the dark room and the pottery studio and the woodwork, like every little thing can't have that. Now we have those all over spread about in the community and people can access those other places. But having one large community gathering center place, public school-ish place seems okay for me. But if they're going to have all these embedded expenses, I just want the legislature, as they're doing this in their wisdom, to make sure they're fully funding like the basic needs of the public school as it thins out. I mean, I think there'll always be people who want the larger public, meet more of their neighbors. They like the larger scene. Good for them. They could lighten up over there a little bit on their attendance requirements or programming, and they're not. So it makes me impatient with them, and it makes me willing to look elsewhere because I've had it with this the stuckness of it.
Well, and hopefully the competition from more programs like North Star, particularly now accelerated through school choice programs, will encourage conventional schools to change. Do you think
But
that that's possible, that they'll become less rigid because they'll have to compete for families
I,
in a more
I
balanced way?
well, if the principal is not empowered, nor is the superintendent is not empowered, the school committee is
Right.
hardly empowered because it's a state regulation. You got to get to the state DESI, and you're gonna have to get to the state legislature to change things. You can't blame the local principal and the local superintendent and the
Right.
local school committee. They're powerless. That's why I quit and didn't go for any of those jobs, right?
Right.
Um, and so saying, if only you were a little bit more creative over here at Turners Falls High, all the kids wouldn't want to leave, is a little bit like not fair in my taking of it, because the dude can't, the woman, whoever's in principal over there now, they're constrained. They're heavily constrained. They can't say you don't have to come on Thursdays. We're going to create a special program. We're going to do all independent studies for kids who want it. It was really hard for them to do such things. So I have more hesitancy. I'm kind of mad at the state legislature, not at the, not the school choice people, but
Yeah.
the state legislature has to loosen up these things.
And so maybe they'll also feel the competitive pressure, and their constituents
Right.
will
But
demand those
right.
changes. So, I'm optimistic that this could lead to really positive change both within the traditional system and without of it. But yeah, I'd love to hear more. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then this week, I know I'm all spinning in circles again
Yeah,
because
that's okay.
I talked to a friend of, we don't have this in Massachusetts, but we do have charter schools. And I talked to a good friend of mine who is a former charter school principal. And he made me realize that 100% of the funding is following the kids to the Massachusetts charter schools. So, not income, any affluent family can use it too. There's no gradations of who can, it's just the lottery winners get to go to the charter schools.
Mhm.
So $15,000 a head, $12 to $15,000 a kid is following kids out of the public school to the charter schools. I thought it was like 5 or 8 or something. School choice, public school choice is 5,000 because they're only allowed to fill empty slots over at the school public school choice model. But the charter schools are doing the very thing, even larger scale than the ESAs would be doing. And I know the teachers unions and the liberals that I run with have been skeptical of charter schools for that reason, but largely people love the charter schools. We have excellent charter schools where I live in Western Massachusetts. They're oversubscribed, there's wait lists, there's a
Right.
demand, and if you're going to give people a free quality smaller scale option, there's always going to be some people who want them. There's always going to be people who don't have the transportation or they just like the local public school better and they just want to stay at the large central thing, fine. But we're already doing the thing that here I am hemming and hawing about $5,000 with school choice ESAs, and meanwhile we're sending $15,000 to a slew of charter schools, and that's really, I mean, these public schools out of a $20 million budget, they're sending $2 million over to these places, right?
Yeah, and like you said, though, charter schools, as publicly funded, privately run, do end up having to comply with various state regulations that
Right,
you may not want, or your families who go to North Star might not want to be a part of, like standardized testing and increased accountability, as a trade off for kind of more freedom and more autonomy that these charter schools often have. But you're right. This is the model, right? Like they're providing more choice. I mean, they were charter schools were really, one of the early parts of this puzzle of really providing more choice to families. And interestingly, the push for charter schools began on the political left,
right.
and through the teachers union, in fact. So it's interesting to see this evolution of choice. And I wonder, Ken, if you've thought at all about some of the states now that have passed these ESAs. I'm thinking of places like Arizona and Florida and Utah and West Virginia and to some extent New Hampshire with their more limited ESA. Are you finding that there are people who are interested in starting self-directed learning centers, North Star learning centers in those states? Are you encouraging people to do that? Like, sort of how has your awakening to school choice policies impacted your thought process around catalyzing more North Star programs in those places?
So not yet. People are not coming to me yet saying, "Hey, we have ESAs. Can you tell me how to do a North Star here?" That hasn't happened yet. Um, and this awareness for me is new since January. So now every conversation I have is in front of my head. So I'm talking to somebody in a different state. I said, "Have you heard about ESAs in your state? Well, tell me what's going on there." So it's becoming a part of my normal conversations, right? I think we're on the cusp of it, but no, it hasn't really happened yet. But I know you're doing interviews. I saw the article in Forbes about the folks in Florida, and what's really intriguing, and partly allaying some of my political concerns is that as much as the impetus for this is coming from the conservative side of things at the moment, they're 100% open to seeing liberals start their own programs on micro schools and ESAs, but like the conservatives are 100% fine with you do your school for your, like they're far less concerned than I am. Let's put it that way, right? They're like, you go ahead.
Yes. Yes, and I'm hopeful and that will continue, right? So that a lot of these school choice policies have been promoted and passed through Republican legislatures that are acknowledging again this benefit of decentralized and diverse education options. I am hopeful that that stays that way because I think that this is the only way school choice works in the long term is if people on the political left and the political right can be comfortable with the fact that families will make education choices that are right for their families that may not reflect our personal educational values, and that's okay, right? That it will be this very pluralistic educational ecosystem that will, again, provide that maximum choice for families.
Right. And I say in my book, I say over the place that we know how to work with kids really well outside of schools over the summers. There's all kinds of
Right.
camps, after school programs, on the weekends, right? 4-H and scouts and there's so many things for kids to do outside of, and we do it very well. That kids love a lot of their out of school activities, right? And that ESAs are a way to broaden that. And if I'm fine with that, I don't worry what conservatives are doing on their weekends. I don't worry about their summer camp. Like, fine, we're looking for the best options for our kids, and sometimes we overlap, and sometimes we don't. And
Right.
I can imagine that expanding, and that's the vision, right? That's the larger direction here. And so I'm just gonna, I guess I'm just backstopping. Like, can we just make sure that as we allow more people to leave the public school, that the public school has enough to cover its already like overhead, to have all those woodworking shop with the resources that it already has. and
Right,
not,
and
and
you
that's the
are
legislator's job, not the school choice people's
right,
job. The
exactly.
legislature should fund it in a way, just like the charter school thing is, it's the legislator's fault, not the charter school's fault. Good people are creating cool charter schools that people want to go to. The fund should just come from the legislature without so being, in my opinion, punitive to the public school, or in a the public school is left having to do a lot of things with, that don't get diminished cost wise. So that's a legislator's fault, not the school choice fault.
Well, I think you are finding in several of the recent states that have passed expansive education savings accounts programs, they have passed these ESA programs in parallel with teacher raises and sort of raising funding in the states. So that seems to be going hand in hand in several states to
Yep.
hopefully alleviate some of those concerns. So, so for you and I, we're very much believers in self-directed, non-coercive learning. This is the educational philosophy that we prefer, that we, think is right for many people. I wonder if you could give your plug then, as you have, potentially aspiring education entrepreneurs all across the country, and especially in these states that now have robust school choice policies. What is your plug for self-directed education and specifically the North Star model? Why do you think it's the best?
Because coercive education is inherently just plain out disrespectful and mean. And requiring kids to do things that are essentially arbitrary is not acceptable. And kids merit respect as much as adults. We all, it's like, for me, it's like a human rights, basic human respect issue, right? And when people invite me to go to lectures or watch a documentary and I say yes or no, or like, I'm allowed to say yes or no. And I think that, it's basic consent. For learners, I just think that's appropriate. I just, it's fine for a parent in a family to say, we're all reading a book a week, or we're having, these limits and requirements here, right? But it's not for um an external person. It's not for the YMCA to require that I go to aerobics class. It's not for the library to require that I read a particular book, right? It's not, these public resource places, or gyms aren't public resources, but the library is. But anyway, when as adults, we belong to places, we use resources, but we get to use them as we wish. And forcing kids, and then, I mean, this just circles back to so many things that have been written for the last 100 years about compulsory schooling, about grades and attendance requirements that are arbitrary and mean, and, Alfie Cohen and punished by rewards. Like, the whole system is flawed. I liked it well enough. I went through it. I became a teacher idealistically. Um, so what can I say? I become diverted as an adult. When I was asked to treat kids accordingly, I couldn't do it. So that's what I think. I think that we all want to be in a place where people are with us because they want to be with us, not because they're required to be with us.
Yeah, and you have now nearly 3 decades of data and a sort of results to prove your model and to prove that it works and that kids turn out fine, even following a more non-traditional educational approach tied to their own interests, with them able to direct their own learning. What have been some of those key takeaways that you've
Well,
observed over the last almost 3 decades, 27
right,
years?
right. In 2017, I did a study of alumni with Peter Gray's advice about alumni outcomes, and it's on the website too. And what's the first thing they do when they leave North Star, and then what's the second thing they do after, right, and so on. And it turns out that for 80 or 82% of the kids that we could count, we're trying to count everybody, most. The first thing they do after North Star is school or something formal. It's hilarious. For all we're saying school is optional, you don't have to go. There's some kids who do a year or two here and go back to middle or high school. There's some kids who go to community college full. I mean, some kids are doing community college while they're still here, but community college and 4-year college right after here. There's kids who are doing AmeriCorps, Peace Corps. There's kids who do adult voc tech school training programs, or the military. So, 80% of the people, when they're done with North Star, the first next thing they do is something formal, organized, right? And then of the 20% who aren't, some of them are entrepreneurial or travelers and musicians and artists and bakers or whatever. They're doing their own thing and they're clever stuff. And another handful are people who are just working ordinary jobs like post high school age 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds do. They're working at Target or whatever, and they're fine, and that's what they're going to do for a while. And then there's a subset of people who came here with real struggles and are still struggling, at 19. Um, but that the takeaway is that it's really okay to grow up from 12 to 18, and presumably from birth to 18, though North Star is starting mostly at 12, but that's my world. But to support people to enjoy their adolescence is really healthy, and to trust them to explore at their own pace, or with at least in conversation in conjunction with their parents, and whatever the demands and requirements are come from there. And sitting down and having a regular non-family adult talk to them once a week, and having a headquarters and a place to go and 65 other kids, and you don't have to invent every activity, and you could do or not do certain things, but just to be trusted and empowered to live this way is healthy. And um that's all. I'll stop there. It's healthy.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remind parents that adolescence can be and should be a joyful time. I wrote about you and North Star in my Unschooled book, and I also interviewed George Popham, who founded the Bay State Learning Center, which is modeled after North Star, part of
Mhm.
the Liberated Learners Network, also in Massachusetts.
One of the
And
most successful ones. Yeah.
yeah, and I remember George saying, teens are happy by nature, right? And it's that they're often in these coercive learning environments that prevent that joy and that happiness. Or like you said, why are kids so sad when their theater program ends, but not sad when your history class ends? And it's because of that coercive dynamic, that lack of autonomy and self-determination. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that too, that this idea that, we it should be a joyful time growing up.
Well, it is, and we know how to do it. This is what's so frustrating, and it's why I'm migrating to the ESAs, because I think that's where the only way to spread it, really, or just largely. But we're good at it in this culture. What kids love summer camps. Kids love their after school programs. Not everybody, some kids are annoyed, but not everybody loves their piano teacher. But anyway, people, we know how to offer activities to children in ways that they really enjoy them and look forward to them every week, and it's the highlight of their week. And if you ask kids, the top 10 events of their week that they look forward to, very few of those things are going to be school classes in the school day, and most of them are going to be after school weekends and or go for the year during the summer, right? Why? It's because we're dopes. It's because we're so stuck. And it's not, again, I think that teachers and principals would be more creative if they could be. I think their hands are largely tied by requirements and rules coming down from above that they can't shirk. When I teach US history and I teach about socialism, I say the public schools are the best model, because it's like the fake, it's the Politburo. It's coming down from above, and the local district isn't really in control. And that, it's all publicly owned and publicly required. So, anyway, it's an aside for you. I find all this politics to be so mixed up and confusing half the time. It's good fun to think about. Um, but we know how to do this. We are good at it uh, at a community level. We just either choose not to or can't do it in schools. And so, to other people entering the education world, my suggestion is, find your niche, right? Um, and granted, I say that with a full awareness that public school salaries with benefits and pensions are significantly higher than anything out here in liberated learners land, probably higher than in most public schools, but I don't know that for a fact. And so there's an appeal to trying to get into the public school where most of the people are, and doing the best you can and finding a good place to work there. And if that's a financial requirement for you, I'm not judging that, for sure. Go ahead and
Mhm.
do that. Find your place. But really trying to create as much space to offer kids choice is the goal. And for me, I want more choice than most public schools create space for.
So Ken, you have such a phenomenal perspective on this as someone who created one of the first learning centers, micro schools, we might say, almost 30 years ago. And now seeing the growth of not only North Star model, but all of these other micro schools and homeschooling more generally. Are you optimistic for the future of alternative education and some of these emerging models? Or what is your sense of what will happen over the next decade plus?
Well, I have a personal and I have a larger perspective. Personal perspective, as I said way a long time ago when I was working with Joel at the very beginning, I have my own 45-year plan. I started North Star when I was 30. First 15 years were just North Star, and the last 15 years would be just speechifying, consulting, meeting, writing, preaching, what we're doing. And the middle 15 would be my transition. So I got the TED Talk in the book, and I'm on my way. This is year 27. A couple more years of being in here day to day grind with North Star because it's fun. And at some point, I need just to step back and turn this over to other people, which were pretty stable. So, my own arc is I want to spend the larger part of my career wrestling with these ideas and fomenting larger scale issues. Um, at the same time, I've also felt from the beginning, as I mentioned earlier, that cultural forces are far larger than I can control. I can ride the wave, I can be part of it. I don't think I can direct it. I don't think any of us can. I don't think any of it's some things are unpredictable, like the pandemic. Um, what's going to happen, the rise of these ESAs is something I didn't really, I guess some people wanted to predict that long ago, but um, it's really hard to predict what's going to work and what's not. Um, but I feel like I it the the train is out of the station with ESAs, with homeschooling. Homeschooling is growing tremendously, and it's going to continue to grow tremendously. More than any other alternative school movement. There's not that many more Sudburys than 20 years ago. There's not that many more democratic free schools. You know, we have pals in the Agile Network, but I'm not sure how many of those there are. The thing that's growing exponentially in the last 25 years is homeschooling, and that includes conventional people, not just unschooling people, but the whole movement is growing. That's not going backwards. And there will be some large scale players above my pay grade who will offer support resources, centers, online platforms, some of which are more like in the affordability range of the out schools of I just met last week with the fellow from KaiPod, Amar,
Yeah.
interesting fellow. And then there's people at the far end, very high priced end of things too, or selling very conventional tutoring. You can homeschool, but we'll help you out. You'll do better than school with conventional algebra. And it doesn't appeal to me that much, right? But there's gonna be a whole range of approaches, some of which come with big resources and big professional marketing and big professional services. And there's going to be a bunch of local people like myself or others who are doing it small scale in their own communities, and it's far bigger. I'm optimistic that's happening. I'm not 100% optimistic. I liken it to like the natural. If I say North Star was the natural food thing of the 1960s basement, now you got Whole Foods. Now you got the natural foods aisle and Stop and Shop. You got farmers markets everywhere, right? Um, North Star will be in there someplace. Probably, we might become redundant if everything flows and there's so much ESA money that you don't even need a center anymore. Because I don't know, I don't really fear that. I'm more amused or interested to see how that flows. It's big. It's a huge picture to me, and I appreciate my role for my 25 years, 27 years so far. I got another 15, 20 years in it for me, but um, I'm in the middle of it. But it's so my vision is like that organic thing. There'll be some Whole Foods, there'll be some local markets, there'll be some farmers markets, there'll be backyard growers, right? And still, loads of people will shop at Stop and Shop and Safeway, right? And
Right.
the traditional groceries and the traditional grocery store. So
Right.
that's the public school in my lovely model. I don't know how. I don't know the pace, and I don't know who those players are, but I just like as a history teacher, I just don't think like I can control it, right? I want to be aware, like, and the fact that I'm like missing the boat on the ESA trend, like, oh, I got to catch up to that one, and I am, um, because like that's really happening, and I think more than I know, there's other forms of it too, like tax credit, scholarships, and stuff we haven't talked about, but I think the ESA model is the most powerful one that I'm learning about this year, and so yeah, I'm gonna catch up. I'll get there, and I'll be enthusiastic, and I'll just want some checks and I don't know. But I don't know. What do you think? I mean, you must be enthusiastic too with all the people coming in. But I'm worried that all these people get in and then they can't sustain it, and then creating all these programs and micro schools that last 2 3 years and then they all close because people need to make a living and they can't. Is discouraging. It's part of the own phase. But what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm hugely optimistic about the future of education, particularly this more decentralized, community-based model that's being activated by everyday entrepreneurs, most of whom are teachers or parents who are trying to solve a problem for their own community and bring others along. So I am very optimistic about that, and I think you're right that education choice programs will accelerate that and really provide many more choices to more families. And I think, you said you can't control it. I think that's true, but you can certainly inspire it. And I see that's really your role. You've been inspiring homeschoolers and entrepreneurs and parents and obviously learners for so many years now. And I think you'll continue to do that and really be a beacon of what's possible in alternative education spaces. So I wonder, Ken, if you could share again how my listeners and viewers can connect with you, some of those websites for them to learn more.
Sure, sure. And just going forward, I'll be camped out with you at the unschooling side of things more than the
Yes.
mainstream side of things.
More than the
But
what?
don't forget the mainstream, the
Yeah.
conventional approaches, like that. If all this ESA money goes to conventional private schools that just get kids to sit down and do cozier, more whatever different forms of 5 day a week school, I'm going to be a little disappointed, right? Like that's not my.
Right, but like we said before, we have to be a little bit humble about it to
Oh,
say that even though this is our preferred philosophy,
right.
we can't control what other people choose is right for
Oh,
their family, but we can, and I hope we do, persuade people to our way of thinking.
right. Oh, 100%. I'm not putting you on. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
like, I'm camping out at that far end, and I'm going to be keep pestering
Yes.
people about that, right?
Yes. Yeah. And
Right.
inspiring people. So tell us how we
Right.
can connect.
So North Star is northstarteens.org. Liberated Learners is liberatedlearners.net. And my personal website is kennethdanford.com. And I'm in Western Mass in Sunderland by UMass.
Kenneth Danford, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.